Greetings from India. You are listening to the Businesstalk podcast. I'm Deepak, your host for today's episode. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Daniela Vidart, Assistant Professor of Economics at the University of Connecticut, as our distinguished guest on today's podcast. Dr. Vidart is a macroeconomist with research interest in labor, economic history, and development. Her work combines macroeconomic models with micro data and historical sources to advance understanding of human capital accumulation and its effect on labor market outcomes and economic growth. She earned her PhD in economics from UC San Diego. In this episode, Dr. Daniela Vidar discusses insights from her research, human capital in history, lessons for today's labor markets. So without further delay, let's welcome Dr. Daniela Vidar to the podcast. Dr. Daniela, it's a true privilege to host you today. Thank you for taking the time to join us and discuss your work.
Thank you so much, Deepak. I'm very happy to be here. I'm happy to be talking to you about this cool stuff. Yes.
Thank you. Professor, how does your research define human capital in a historical context? And why is it important for understanding long-term economic growth?
Okay, so very good. So human capital, broadly defined both historically and also for today, is the skills, knowledge, and abilities that people build through education, training, or experience that make them more productive at work. So this is like having a toolbox inside each person. Essentially, the more tools you have, which is the more human capital you have, the more valuable their work is going to be because the more productive they can be in everyday tasks that they do in their jobs. And there are many ways to gain human capital, okay? So I touched on some, but there's more. There's education, which is the classic one we think about, going to school or college. There's also on-the-job training, which is some of what my work is on, understanding how workers learn. There's also learning at work through your colleagues or people around you. That's also something that I touch on. But there's also the role for health, for things like health or nutrition, because of course, staying healthy impacts how productive you can be. So there's many different sort of things, inputs that contribute into the human capital, this toolbox a person has. And it is very important for long-term economic growth, human capital, for sort of three main reasons. The first one, which is more proximate, having a workforce, having, your employed people have higher human capital, it's going to make them more productive, right? We're able to produce more with our current technologies and production processes. But also the second aspect of this is that human capital breeds innovation, okay? It has been shown that people who have higher human capital are more likely to discover or create new technologies that can make us even more productive in the long term, okay? And the third way human capital impacts long-term economic growth is through kind of creating a resilience to technological change. So having well set up systems of human capital formations, so schools, but also on-the-job systems to sort of onboard workers quickly, make it so that we can adapt our skills more quickly if technological change is happening or production processes are changing rapidly. So those are sort of the main ways.
Professor, what are some surprising patterns in education and skill accumulation you discovered from historical data?
Okay, there are many, many interesting ones. How we could, spend a lot of time on this, but I'm going to tell you two recent ones that I've been working on, which I think are really cool. They're exciting. So the first one is the impact of correspondence education, correspondence schools at the turn of the 20th century. So at the turn of the 20th century in the United States, this is, the 1900s, a very large share of men in the US participated in correspondence education, which is learning by mail. Essentially, these men would be at home or they would be working and they would be furthering their education by getting their materials through the mail. Okay, and they would, do their work and send it back, and there was this sort of correspondence for them to do their work. And this is a surprisingly large share of men who were doing this. So by 1940, 5% of prime age, meaning men of ages 25 to 54, had passed through correspondence schools. So it's a very, very large share. And this is surprising because there is actually very little work on the impact of these schools. A lot more has been written about the importance of high school, which also was expanding during these periods, and colleges, but not this alternate form of education. And these men were largely white. They were white men, and they were substituting for high school using this alternate form of education. So maybe they couldn't access high school because they didn't have one nearby, or they had, work responsibilities that kept them away from high school, they could still further their education by doing this correspondence education. So that's the first one that I think is sort of surprising pattern of education and skill accumulation we don't know very much about. The second one I've been working on is about how the lifetime patterns of learning change for workers. So specifically, we and some co-authors use this data from the 1970s, and we can show that the way workers learn new skills on their jobs and become more productive is very closely tied to their age. So in particular, what we find going all the way back to the 70s, but also in the present, is that young workers acquire human capital, acquire new skills by learning from their colleagues. That's the special thing they do as young workers. But as workers become older and they're more in their mid-career, now the thing they rely on to learn new skills and keep accumulating human capital is by engaging in on-the-job training. So formal types of courses, like I attend that course or a conference or a workshop. So not learning from my colleague, but learning from this sort of external sources of learning. And this is interesting, but it also has important implications for thinking, for example, about the impact of remote work. Because with remote work, by definition, you're distancing workers from each other. So for example, you could be distancing young workers from seniors that they are learning from, as we showed, disproportionately. So you could be harming their skill acquisition process. So it's something to think about with regards to remote work as well.
Very insightful. Yes. Dr. Vidart, how did historical labor market participation by gender, region, or social class affect the trajectory of economic development?
Yes, so great question and very, very important. So in the past, in the US, but this is true not only in the US, this is all over the world really, certain groups of people were often prevented from participating in the labor market, not because they choose not to participate, but because there's some limitations tied to their gender, race, etc. So let me give you a concrete example. So Claudia Golden, who was a recent economics Nobel laureate, has documented the widespread prevalence of marriage bars for women in the US, which means specifically that married women were barred from working. So they just, by their marital status, they could not work in certain occupations at all. And this is, of course, bad for them, right, for their families, because they wanted to work and they couldn't. But the thing that's fundamental to think is that it is also bad for all of us, because it is stagnating growth by preventing people from using their talents for production, okay? So in this sense, the rise that we document in women's labor force participation in the United States, per which women, throughout the 20th century started entering the labor force and working more and more and more, but also, for example, the removal of racial barriers that were in place into entering to medical schools or law schools, for example, was very, very important for economic growth. So there is this fantastic paper by Sierra Hurst, Jones, and Clino that shows that between 20% and 40% of US economic growth since 1940 can be explained by the removal of these barriers and the consequent improved allocation of talent. So it is a very important aspect of the economic growth process. Yes.
Professor, can you share example of how investment in human capital historically reduced inequality and what lessons we can draw for today?
Yeah, so let's go back to this correspondence education idea I was expanding on before, this learning by mail and people receiving sort of their educational materials through the mail and being able to advance their education in that way. So the big story of the 20th century in education in the United States was the rise of high schools and colleges. Okay, the big story, the kind of big headline is in the early 20th century in the US, there was this very big push to open more publicly funded high schools, open more colleges, just to expand the access that people could have to these educational institutions. But even with that big push, the spread was still very geographically uneven. Okay, so some cities got high schools much later than others. Okay, that's one thing. And also, because high school is quite a big time commitment, you have to go for 4 years all day. They remained inaccessible. Even if they were in my city, they would remain inaccessible for a lot of people because it was expensive. You were leaving a lot of money on the table that you could get while working to take those 4 years to study instead of using that time to work. Okay. So correspondence education was different because it, first of all, was available nationwide, right? Because it's through the mail. So anybody could get access to these materials if they wanted to. And it provided a pathway to education for a lot of people who would have otherwise been left behind because it was in these areas that maybe didn't have a high school, but also it allowed for this flexibility of when you studied. With a high school is, from 9 to 3 or 4. So that's the kind of fixed schedule. With correspondence education, you could do it at night, you could do it in the weekends. So it's still allowed to work. So it provided that flexibility. Okay. And of course, in my research, I have found that it was not quite as good as high school in terms of promoting occupational mobility and social mobility, but it was still a solid option and much better than doing nothing. Okay. And in this sense, it is a very kind of concrete way in which, human capital investments in this form of correspondence education helped reduce inequality. Because these people who went to correspondence education would have not done anything otherwise because they didn't have a high school or they couldn't attend one. So therefore, correspondence education provided them a pathway to become educated. And that is similar to, say, remote schooling nowadays. So there's a big debate of remote schooling and how good it is and whether it's really like an option that we should think about in educational policy. And the answer is probably yes, because even though it's not quite as good as having children go to school in person, there's a lot of children who cannot do that. Okay. Either because they live in a remote part of the world where it would be too costly to go to school, or they have some other things keeping them from school. For example, this is common with agricultural seasons where they need the children to help with the harvest, for example, and it's keeping them from schools. Well, it would be a lot better for them if they cannot go to school in person to have a remote schooling option. Okay, so remote schooling can fill some of these gaps in the same way that correspondence schools filled those gaps in the early 20th century.
Professor, how do technological changes in the past compare to the digital transformation we are experiencing now in terms of their impact on labor markets?
Yes, so that is also a very good question. And there are many, many ways in which technological changes in the past and the digital transformation of today are important for labor markets. But one that I sort of want to touch on is the comparative impact on women in particular. So, for example, in some of my earlier work, I showed that the spread of electricity in the United States in the early 20th century created a demand for skilled jobs, such as clerical jobs, where women had a comparative advantage. Okay. And the reason for that is that a lot of these jobs were clerical. There were secretarial type jobs or tending to the phones that because they were not physical, they were not, lifting heavy objects or pushing something heavy, they provided a way for women to enter the labor force. Okay. So that electricity directly created those jobs, and it helped spur the rise of female labor force participation with all the growth implications that we have discussed of having this talent now entering the labor force and contributing to production. So this is an example of a historical technological advancement, but I want to come back to remote work, the remote online options that are available now, and specifically being able to work from home, because it is similar in the sense that something that is well documented in today's labor markets is that women are much less likely to be willing to commute a long distance for work. Okay. There's many reasons for this, but one of the prime reasons that have been documented is that women don't want to be very far away from where their children are going to school in case there's an emergency, you have to pick them up. So they don't want to have to be 60 miles away or whatever if something happens. Men don't feel as constrained in that way. And this is a little difficult from the perspective of labor markets for women because it greatly limits which jobs they can access, opportunities for mobility and moving forward with their jobs, because if they're offered a different job that is a lot better, but it's further away, they're less likely to take it, etc. With remote work, we remove some of those barriers. And by doing that, we increase the range of jobs that women can apply to and that they will be likely to take, which again can be very positive from a growth perspective because it helps you match the right worker with the right job. But by that, I mean, before for women, they were choosing the jobs and their match just based on their geographic location. With remote work, they can focus more on which is the job that matches their skills. And we all win from that. We all will gain from that.
Professor, what role did historical institutions such as schools, guilds, or apprenticeship systems play in shaping human capital?
Yes, very good. So historical institutions like schools, guilds, and apprenticeship systems, as you were mentioning, played a crucial role in shaping human capital by essentially providing a structured way, a structured system to transfer knowledge, skills, etc., across generations. So all of these systems have the same sort of pattern as their foundation, which is a way of giving younger generations the skills that are used for that specific occupation that they're looking at. So I want to focus a bit more on guilds and apprenticeships because I think people think of these as being something that is historical, right? It's like, oh, yes, in the past we had guilds or we had apprenticeships and we don't have them anymore. But that is really not true, okay? So just as a bit of background, guilds, which were popular in Europe and other parts of the world, they regulated the trade professions by setting standards, ensuring quality control, and also protecting the interests of their members, which helped maintain and improve skill levels. So it was, again, this way of kind of transferring skills across generations. Apprenticeship systems were similar in the sense that they offered this hands-on training, allowing individuals to learn specialized skills under experienced mentors, okay? And as I mentioned, this is not a thing of the past. We have this in place today. Many professions have formal apprenticeships, are part of the getting into that profession, or guild type institutions through licensing and things of the sort as part of being a person in this profession. But even for the ones that don't have that formally, they don't have the formal apprenticeship system or a formal licensing kind of guild type system, we document sort of in some of the work that I've done that the fact that there is such widespread learning of young workers from their seniors shows a prevalence of this similar type of institution, of this bottom down type of learning, transferring of skills across generations, which we had, have had historically with apprentices and within guilds. So it is very much, the modern equivalent of this historical institutions is just what we document every day in jobs all over the world of young workers learning, whether it's formally or informally, from their more senior coworkers. Okay. And it is similar also in the sense that for guilds and for apprenticeships, workers usually are willing to work at a very low wage because they know that they're going to be getting skills from that then they can use and get a higher wage. And this is very similar to nowadays because a lot of workers are willing to be paid lower than they would otherwise to go to certain employers, to go to certain firms where they are provided with a lot of opportunities to learn from talented seniors so they can advance their skills, advance their human capital. So this is really, these apprenticeship guild type systems, both historical or today, are playing this crucial role that we need in society of transferring human capital across generations. And it's still, an important part of how we acquire human capital today.
Dr. Vidart, how can historical insights help policymakers today address persistent labor market challenges such as skill mismatches and underemployment?
Okay, so first thing I will say is that talent barriers matter. Okay, so related to what we were discussing before, the past exclusion of women and minorities wasted human capital. Okay, and it affected them personally, but all of us as a society as well. So today, tackling bias or other hurdles can expand effective labor supply and provide a pathway for economic growth that is, relatively cheap and easy, of just, rearranging your labor markets to have opportunity to match the right workers to the right jobs. So that's the first way. The second thing to bear in mind is that skill mismatches repeat. Essentially, we've had then deindustrialization and automation all have contributed throughout history and today to produce mismatch. in terms of the skills that are needed in some jobs and the skills that the workers have. And the historical adjustments to this involved training, mobility of jobs, of saying, okay, you're in this job, let's move you to this different job, which better matches what we need for today with technological change, and also institutional support, okay? But it was not perfect. So what policymakers can learn from that is to invest in reskilling and mobility programs. So for example, a policy like the GI Bill in the United States, which is meant to provide veterans, military veterans that go to wars and do service with education opportunities at a low cost, is key to integrating them into the labor force after the military service and giving them the skills they need for being in the labor force. Extending these types of programs sort of more broadly could be greater beneficial in this kind of rapidly evolving technological change world to kind of improve the mismatches between skills that workers have and skills that are needed in the labor market.
Professor, are there historical periods where neglecting human capital lead to long-term economic stagnation? And what can modern economists learn from these cases?
Yes, so there are many examples of historical periods or specific types of institutions that neglected human capital and that caused these sort of economic growth costs. So I will give you two sort of famous examples. So first, the classic example people think about is the Dark Ages in Europe, where in this medieval period, reading and writing was reserved for the Catholic Church. So the only people who, for the most part, could read or write were people associated with the Catholic Church, and the rest of the common folk did not have access to those skills. And that was, of course, terrible because it limited sort of the skill acquisition process for the common folk. So that was one example. Another example is colonial or slavery-based economies that focus on extraction and failed to put in systems for education that also stagnated them for decades. If you're just focused on extraction, whether it's of natural resources or else, and don't put systems for education to think, if I educate the next generation, they'll be more productive and they'll contribute to economic growth, you're going to generate a lot of losses. So the lesson is that economies that fail to invest widely in human capital are going to trap themselves in low productivity equilibria. And not only that, it also persists for generations. Again, because of this top-down pattern of learning where elders are teaching young people. Okay, so if we do not put in systems of human capital formation, the young generation won't learn, but also as they become older, those younger generations after them will also learn less because they don't have this kind of skilled seniors to learn from. So modern economies should invest in education. We sort of all know that. That is, I think, an uncontroversial statement. But a concrete way of furthering this, particularly in the workforce, is to provide support in the form of subsidies or other incentives to firms that provide training or mentoring opportunities for their workers. Because firms often are reluctant to provide opportunities, especially if it's a worker they don't know or they don't know what their trajectory is going to be. If governments and policies can kind of enter and fill in some of these gaps to spur more of this kind of transfer of skills within the firm, that can have pretty important consequences for long-term economic growth.
Professor, how does the pace of human capital accumulation historically influence a country's resilience to economic shocks or technological disruption?
Yes, I think there are two main ways that human capital can help us deal with economic shocks or technological change. The first one is that human capital, this sort of toolbox or education broadly, it gives you skills to be more productive at your current tasks, but also it has been shown that it creates in the brain this sort of plasticity where you can more easily adapt and learn new tasks. And this is, of course, very important for adapting to economic shocks or new technologies. It's not just about you're good at the current tasks. Human capital also allows you to more faster learn how to do newer tasks that come with technological change and economic shocks. So I think that's one key way. The second key way is that having in place robust systems for human capital formation makes it such that we can quickly begin teaching new skills as needed when there is economic disruption. And this means this should be in place both at the school level, with schools being able to sort of quickly respond to technological change and things changing, but also, as we've been discussing, on the job. Having this kind of formal systems of having mentoring and having ways of seniors to teach juniors can help kind of adapt once technological change comes to us.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Looking at your findings, what are the most pressing lessons for contemporary labor markets in developing versus developed economies?
Very good. So I will say this about developing countries, which is sort of a good and bad thing. Labor markets in developing countries tend to have a lot more churn, meaning that there's a lot of movement of workers from one job to the next, to the informal economy and back, and then from firm A to firm B, etc. I say that that is both good and bad because some churn is, of course, good to keep dynamism in the economy. You don't want to have workers that are forced in like to one firm for life and they cannot move. That, of course, is not ideal. But having so much churn, as has been documented in the developing world, is also challenging because workers don't stay long enough on the job to make it worth it for the firm to train them. And that leads to a lack of productivity gains. If the firm knows that the worker is very likely going to leave very soon to a different job because of all this churn, what is their incentive to train them? Okay. So I think that in terms of human capital for developing countries, and given this labor market particularities of having a lot of churn, the thing that is going to be important to promote on the job training and promote on the job human capital formation is to find a way to create more long lasting and robust contracts between firms and workers. And this is, of course, very hard because we have to tackle the reasons that cause workers to churn so much and to change so much. But really thinking seriously about that, I think is going to be quite important to addressing human capital gaps and on the job human capital formation gaps for workers in the developing world and lead to a more productive and more resilient and also faster growing economies.
Listeners, let's wrap up our conversation with Dr. Daniela Vidart. Today, we explored how historical patterns of education, skills, and labor market participation have shaped long-term economic growth and what these lessons can teach us about addressing inequality, adapting to technological change, and building stronger labor markets today. We thank Dr. Vidart for sharing her invaluable insights and for helping us to connect the past to the challenges and opportunities facing today's workforce. Stay tuned for future episodes as we continue to explore research that informs policy, practice, and the broader understanding of our economy. Thank you once again, Dr. Daniela Vidart, for joining us.
Thank you, Deepak. It's been wonderful to join you here. Thank you.